how I quietly took down the boss, who tried to erase me, saved my company, and then. I've always believed that the most dangerous people in any workplace aren't the loud, aggressive types who bark orders and make their presence known in every room they enter. It's the ones who quietly convince themselves they're the smartest person in the room, without once bothering to look around and check who else might actually be sitting at the table. My name's Rachel, and I've worked at Nextra Systems in Chicago for over a decade now. I've seen this company claw its way through two economic downturns, a disastrous rebranding that nearly tanked our entire reputation, and a cyber attack that left half the tech industry gasping. I'm not flashy, and I've never been one to shove my title in anyone's face or make a scene during meetings. I don't plaster my achievements all over LinkedIn, and I'm definitely not the type who name drops to feel important. But here's what mattered. There wasn't a single person on the 10th floor who knew this company inside and out the way I did. I'd built teams from the ground up, rescued critical accounts when others failed, and kept us afloat when everything else seemed ready to collapse. What no one knew, not my closest colleagues, not even my best friend on the analytics team, was that 5 years ago, I became the silent force keeping Nextra alive. When the company faced its darkest hour, teetering on the edge of bankruptcy after an investor scandal, it was my late aunt's inheritance that saved us. I used every cent to quietly buy a controlling stake through an out-of-state holding firm. No press releases, no internal memo, not a whisper beyond the legal paperwork. I didn't do it for recognition or leverage. I did it because I believed Nextra deserved a chance, even if most of its leaders didn't. Then came Carter. Carter swept in at 41. All polished shoes and perfectly tailored suits, freshly plucked from a failed startup on the West Coast and boasting an MBA from Harvard like it was a crown. His handshake was firm, his grin too perfect, and his speeches rehearsed within an inch of their lives. I still remember his first meeting with our executive team. Carter stood there, radiating confidence as if he'd just invented leadership itself. He talked about change as if it were some shiny new product we'd all somehow overlooked. From day one, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I knew change wasn't always a bad thing. We'd stagnated in some ways, and maybe fresh energy could help. But it didn't take long, barely 2 weeks, for the cracks to show. Carter wasn't here to build or inspire. He was here to conquer. It started with small things. Administrative roles quietly eliminated, leaving teams scrambling without the support they'd relied on for years. Long-standing projects abruptly shelved because they didn't fit his vision. People who had given this company a decade of their lives were suddenly labeled as deadweight, their contributions erased by slick presentations and buzzwords. Every meeting became a stage for Carter to perform, and every slide deck was designed to cast him as the hero of Nextra's future. I tried to stay neutral, tried to focus on my team and our work. I had built the analytics division from scratch when no one else thought we needed one. We were the people who flagged vulnerabilities before the cyber attack, the ones who kept our systems from crumbling during the financial crisis. Just last year, the models my team built prevented what could have been a multi-million-dollar loss during a vendor collapse. None of that seemed to matter to Carter. By his third week, Carter hadn't asked me a single thing about my department. Not one question about what we did, what we'd achieved, or how we could help with his so-called transformation. To him, I was just another name on an org chart, one he probably meant to cross out eventually. One Thursday morning, as I was reviewing projections for an upcoming client renewal, his assistant appeared at my office door. She didn't look me in the eye as she spoke. "Carter would like to see you in conference room D," she said. Now, no context, no explanation, just an order delivered like a summons. I saved my work, grabbed my laptop, and walked down the hall. The sound of my heels on the marble tile echoed louder than usual, the hallway strangely silent at that hour. When I entered the room, Carter was already seated at the head of the table, his arms folded, posture stiff. The blinds were drawn, and the overhead lights were far too bright, making the space feel more like an interrogation chamber than a meeting room. Without even glancing up, he started speaking. "Let's keep this brief, Rachel," he said. I sat down, calm but alert. Finally, he looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of what I can only describe as condescension in his eyes. "I've been reviewing your department's output," he said, "and frankly, I'm not impressed. The tools your team developed are outdated. There's no innovation happening under your leadership." I didn't blink, didn't flinch. "Outdated according to what?" I asked. Carter shrugged like he didn't need to justify it. Industry standards, market benchmarks, my gut. Take your pick. Either way, he continued, it's time to streamline. You've plateaued, Rachel, and it's time we acknowledge that. Then came the line I'll never forget. You're replaceable, he said. You don't add anything here. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not anger, not fear, but a kind of quiet certainty. I smiled, just a little, because I realized how much fun the next chapter was going to be. I think the silence after Carter's declaration was louder than anything he could have said. For a moment, he seemed to expect me to argue or maybe to beg for a chance to prove my worth. I could see the confusion flicker across his face when I simply leaned back in my chair and regarded him calmly. He had walked into that room convinced that I would crumble under the weight of his authority, but I had spent too many years building this company from the inside to be rattled by empty words. When he told me that I added nothing here, something inside me felt almost amused rather than insulted. I had spent the last decade keeping Nexra's foundation steady while men like him came and went, each convinced they were the one to reshape the future. I let the silence stretch long enough to make him uncomfortable before I finally spoke. If I'm so useless, I said quietly, then go ahead and fire me. His expression faltered, as if the script he had written for this meeting didn't account for defiance. Excuse me, he asked, clearly thrown off. I leaned forward slightly so that my words would land where they needed to. If you truly believe I'm replaceable, then don't waste time with this performance. Call HR, draw up the paperwork, and let's end it right here. For the first time since I had met him, Carter didn't seem sure of himself. He sat there blinking at me, probably trying to figure out why his plan wasn't going as smoothly as he'd envisioned. I left that room with a polite nod, my heart steady and my mind sharper than it had been in months. The hallways felt different on the walk back to my office, like the walls themselves had been waiting for someone to finally challenge the storm brewing at the top. By the time I reached my desk, I knew what I needed to do next. I wasn't angry, not really. What I felt was a readiness I hadn't known I'd been suppressing for so long. That afternoon, the whispers began. They always do in offices like ours, where tension lives just beneath the surface of polite smiles and calendar invites. People noticed the way I left the conference room, calm and unshaken, and that's what unsettled them. They were used to seeing fear or frustration in the wake of Carter's meetings, but not this quiet certainty. Carter spent the rest of the day striding through the halls, shaking hands with junior staff, holding court with his chosen circle of eager new managers. But I knew he was laying groundwork, preparing for the next phase of his plan. What he didn't know was that I was preparing too. That evening, I reviewed every document tied to my holding company, confirming again what I already knew, that my majority ownership of Nexra was secure, silent, and powerful. I had never needed to show my hand before, but Carter was forcing the game to change. I spent hours combing through operational reports, financials, and risk assessments. Every number told a story, and I intended to make sure mine was heard. The next morning, I got the call I'd expected. It was Karen from legal, someone I trusted as much as anyone in this business. Her voice was steady, but I could hear the undertone of concern. Rachel, she said, I reviewed the restructuring proposal Carter submitted for next week's board meeting. Your department isn't included in the future plan. He's proposing to dissolve analytics entirely and shift functions to outside vendors. And here's where it gets interesting. He listed shareholder approval as pending, but we both know he hasn't spoken to you. I smiled, though she couldn't see it. Of course he hadn't. Carter wasn't the type to ask questions when he thought he already had all the answers. I thanked her for the heads up and told her exactly what I intended to do. Nothing. Not yet. Because men like Carter don't learn through warnings or kind explanations. They only learn through consequences. And his were coming, whether he saw them on the horizon or not. The following days were a study in restraint. I attended meetings, responded to emails, and kept my usual routine. But beneath the surface, I was documenting everything. I kept records of every decision that impacted my team, every access denial, every memo that came from his office subtly undermining my work. My inbox became a quiet archive of the campaign he was waging. People started sending me anonymous notes through the internal portal, short messages of support, gratitude, and shared frustration. Carter, meanwhile, continued his performance. His presentations grew flashier, his meetings more dramatic. He spoke of innovation and efficiency, but anyone paying attention could see that his real goal was control. He didn't want to lead Nexera into the future. He wanted to remake it in his own image, no matter what was lost along the way. I watched as he pushed out long-standing managers, replaced them with loyalists who parroted his ideas, and dismantled systems that had kept us stable during our hardest years. Every day, I felt the tension building, like a storm gathering just beyond sight. I knew the board meeting would be the breaking point. I reviewed my notes each night, refining the case I would present when the moment came. I wasn't interested in revenge. What I wanted was to protect what we had built, not just for me, but for the people who had given so much to Nexera without ever asking for recognition. When the morning of the board meeting finally arrived, the winter sunlight cut through the glass walls of the building, sharp and cold. I dressed with care, choosing a tailored gray jacket, a simple black dress, and boots polished to a shine. I wanted to send a message without saying a word. I arrived early, taking a seat near the end of the long table, where I could see everything and everyone. Carter arrived moments before the meeting began, his smile confident, his voice smooth as he greeted the board members. As he launched into his presentation, I listened with the same calm I'd shown in that conference room days earlier. His slides were filled with jargon, his charts designed to dazzle rather than inform. When he finally reached the section where he proposed the restructuring of my division, he didn't so much as glance in my direction. He spoke as if I were invisible, as if I hadn't been part of the company's history or its survival. When he finished, the room fell silent. The chairman turned to him and asked the necessary question. Do we have shareholder approval for these changes? Carter, still confident, nodded and said it was pending but not expected to be a problem. That was my cue. I cleared my throat gently, and every head in the room turned toward me. I'm afraid I can't approve that, I said, my voice clear and steady. Carter blinked, confused, his smile faltering for the first time. And in that moment, I knew the tide had begun to turn. For a few seconds, Carter just stared at me as if he didn't understand what I had said. His mouth opened as if he meant to speak, but no words came out, and for the first time since he set foot in Nexera, he looked like a man who wasn't in control of the room. I let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle. Then I reached into my folder and slid a document across the polished surface of the table toward the chairman. Without raising my voice or changing my expression, I said that as majority shareholder, I was declining to approve Carter's proposed changes. The chairman took the paper, brows furrowed, scanning the confirmation of my ownership, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the document as he processed what it meant. Beside him, Karen from legal leaned in, reviewing the text, then gave a small nod of affirmation that carried more weight than any speech could have. Carter finally found his voice, but it had lost the smooth confidence it always carried. He asked me what authority I thought I had to override his strategic decisions. I kept my gaze steady and replied that my authority came from the very ownership structure he hadn't bothered to research before attempting to gut the company's core teams. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the heating vents as he tried to recover, his face losing its usual polish, replaced by the pink flush of someone realizing they'd walked straight into their own trap. He stammered something about transparency, about how no one had informed him of my stake, as if it were the fault of others that he'd charged ahead without understanding who held the keys to the kingdom he wanted to rule. I let him speak, because sometimes silence is the most powerful statement of all. When he finally stopped, I calmly reminded him that he never asked. He assumed, and that assumption had led him exactly where he was now, cornered, exposed, and unsure of his next move. The chairman leaned back in his chair, glancing at the other board members, then at Karen, as if seeking confirmation that this moment was, in fact, as significant as it felt. Carter sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table, as if holding on might somehow steady him. The chairman announced that the meeting would pause for a brief recess, asking me to stay behind. As the others gathered their papers and left the room, Carter hesitated as if he wanted to say something but ultimately thought better of it. When the door clicked shut and we were alone, the chairman regarded me with something between respect and curiosity. He admitted that he had always wondered how I remained so composed through all the chaos of recent weeks. I told him the truth. I had spent years learning when to speak and when to let actions speak for themselves. He asked why I had stayed silent for so long, why I hadn't asserted my position sooner. I answered simply that I didn't want power for its own sake. What I wanted was to see who would rise with integrity and who would try to climb over others without looking down. We spoke quietly while the rest of the board filtered back into the room. The atmosphere now noticeably changed. When Carter returned, he no longer carried himself like the master of the room. His stride had lost its usual swagger, and his eyes darted to me, then to the chairman, searching for some way to salvage the moment. But the damage was done, and we both knew it. The chairman reopened the meeting with a simple, steady statement. Given the information provided, the proposed restructuring would not proceed. Instead, he said, the board would review the situation fully, including the recent leadership actions that had led us here. Carter tried, one last time, to defend himself, his words coming faster now, as if volume and speed could make up for substance. He painted his decisions as bold innovation, claimed his restructuring plans were misunderstood brilliance, but the room no longer belonged to him. When he realized no one was buying what he was selling, he turned to me, his voice rising with frustration. He accused me of setting him up, of trapping him, of manipulating the board into seeing him as a villain. I didn't bother to raise my voice or match his tone. I simply told him the truth, that he had set his own trap by underestimating the people who kept Nexera standing. He had written a script in his mind where he was the hero and the rest of us were obstacles. He never considered that some of us were the reason there was even a stage left for him to perform on. The chairman brought the meeting to a close with a decision that felt inevitable by that point. Carter was suspended, effective immediately, pending a formal review by the board's ethics committee. Security would see him out, and a statement would be issued by the end of the day. The look on Carter's face was something I'll remember for a long time. Not anger, not even humiliation, but pure disbelief. He had come here to remake Nexera in his image, and instead, he was being walked out of the building he thought he'd come to command. When the door closed behind him, the room seemed to exhale all at once, as if the tension that had been building for weeks had finally found release. The chairman turned to me, his voice softer now, and said that by standing my ground, I hadn't just protected myself. I had protected Nexera. I nodded, but I didn't smile. There was nothing to celebrate yet, because I knew that this wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. It was just the end of the first act, and the real test was still to come. I spent that afternoon reviewing everything again. The records, the reports, the messages from colleagues who had been too afraid to speak. I knew Carter wouldn't give up easily. Men like him don't fade quietly. They regroup, they plot, and they look for new angles. But I was ready. I had spent years preparing for moments just like this, even when I didn't know exactly what form they would take. As I left the office that evening, the city skyline glowed against the night, and for the first time in a long while, I felt steady. Not because I had won anything yet, but because I had finally made it clear that I wouldn't let someone else write my story for me. And whatever came next, I would face it on my own terms. The next few days felt like walking across a frozen lake, every step deliberate, every sound sharper in the heavy silence that had settled over Nexera. People moved through the halls with careful glances, unsure if it was safe to speak openly again or if another storm was waiting just out of sight. There were no grand announcements, no emails declaring victory or change. But the absence of Carter's voice in meetings, the lack of his presence striding down corridors, spoke volumes. It was as if the entire building had taken a deep breath for the first time in weeks. I didn't rush to claim any new title or position. That wasn't what I wanted, not then and not ever. What I wanted was to stabilize the ground he had so carelessly shaken, to make sure that the damage he'd done didn't spread further. When the board asked me to step in as interim head of strategy, I agreed on one condition: that I be given the freedom to rebuild trust, not just operations. I wasn't interested in quick fixes or empty promises. I wanted lasting change that the people here could feel and believe in. Over the next week, I set about untangling the mess Carter had left behind. I reinstated access to systems that had been stripped away under his so-called streamlining. I met with every department head one by one, not in formal settings, but in quiet corners and break rooms, where real conversations could happen without scripts or pretense. I asked questions, and then I listened. Really listened. Not for the answers I wanted to hear, but for the truths people had been too afraid to voice while Carter was in charge. The messages through the internal portal kept coming, too. Some were brief, just a line or two of thanks or encouragement. Others were longer, detailing stories of teams dismantled overnight, roles erased without warning, contributions dismissed in favor of flashier ideas with no real backbone. I read every single one, and I kept them all in a file, not as ammunition, but as proof that what had happened under Carter wasn't just about me. It was about a culture that had started to rot at the edges the moment arrogance was allowed to pass for leadership. Carter, for his part, tried to negotiate his exit behind the scenes. I heard through Karen that he had pushed for a quiet severance deal, hoping to slip away with a package that might salvage his pride, if not his career. But the board wasn't interested in saving face for a man who had endangered the very company he claimed to want to lead. The final report was clear: abuse of authority, manipulation of internal systems, and an attempt to mislead the board for personal gain. There would be no farewell party, no glowing tribute on the company website. One day he was here, and the next, he was gone. Even without his shadow looming over every meeting, I knew we weren't finished reckoning with what he had left behind. People were wary, watching to see if this would be just another reset, another temporary fix that faded when the next shiny leader arrived. That's why I moved carefully, deliberately, rebuilding not just workflows but faith. I opened channels Carter had shut down, reinstated collaborative groups that had been dissolved, and encouraged anonymous feedback at every stage. I didn't want applause or recognition. I wanted people to feel that their voices mattered again. I made sure that the quietest employees, the ones who had watched from the sidelines in fear or frustration, knew they could speak without being silenced. One message that came through stuck with me most. It was from a junior developer I hadn't met yet, and all it said was, "When I saw you stand your ground, I realized I didn't have to be afraid anymore." That single sentence reminded me what all of this was for: not power, not pride, but the simple human need to be seen and heard. As the days turned into weeks, the mood at Nexra shifted slowly, like ice beginning to melt after a long winter. People started to smile again in meetings, to share ideas without glancing over their shoulders. The tension in the air began to ease, replaced by something like cautious hope. The board met again a month after Carter's removal, this time to discuss the future in earnest. When I was called into the chairman's office ahead of the meeting, I expected another discussion about interim plans, maybe advice on who might take on a permanent role. Instead, he slid an envelope across the desk with my name printed on it in clean, simple lettering. Inside was the formal offer for the position Carter had once held: Executive Director of Strategic Operations. I looked up, surprised, and told him I hadn't asked for this, that it wasn't what I was working toward. He smiled, not a smug smile like Carter's, but one of quiet understanding, and said that was exactly why I was the right choice. I didn't answer right away. I thought about everything that had happened, everything that could still happen, and then I said what I knew had to be said. If I accept, I want more than a title. I want real authority to build something better, to make sure this company never ends up in the hands of another Carter. I want values to come first in every hire, every promotion, every decision. He agreed without hesitation, and for the first time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. That night, I stayed late at the office, standing by the window overlooking the city. The skyline flickered in the darkness, a reminder of how many stories were unfolding beyond our walls, how many battles like mine were being fought quietly every day. I thought about the first day I'd walked into Nexera, nervous and determined, unsure if anyone would ever notice what I could do. And now, after everything, I finally understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay true to yourself, even when the world tries to write a different story for you. When I left the office that night, I didn't feel triumphant or victorious. I felt steady, ready for the real work ahead. And I knew, without a doubt, that this was only the beginning. The weeks that followed felt quieter than I expected, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that leaves you watching shadows, wondering where the next move will come from. Nexera started to breathe again, slowly but noticeably, as teams began to feel safe enough to speak and contribute without second-guessing themselves. I focused on rebuilding, on strengthening the foundation so that no one like Carter could ever fracture it again. But something about the stillness didn't sit right with me. As if the storm had only paused rather than passed. I stayed vigilant, reviewing reports and keeping a close eye on ownership records, vendor contracts, and anything that might reveal loose threads Carter could pull. And then one evening, as I sifted through documents after hours, I found something that made my stomach knot in a way I hadn't felt since the first day I realized what Carter was truly after. There, buried in a filing system few bothered to check, were records of small, seemingly insignificant stock acquisitions. They weren't in Carter's name, of course, but the pattern was too deliberate to ignore. Over the last several weeks, shares had quietly changed hands, bought up through shell companies registered in distant states. The trail was faint but visible to someone who knew where to look. And at the end of that trail, I saw the name of an investor group with known ties to Carter's former associates. It didn't take much to connect the dots. Carter had been plotting a return, this time from the outside, using financial maneuvers rather than office politics. The plan was clear, a hostile takeover masked as a fresh investment opportunity. I didn't panic, but I didn't waste time either. I gathered every piece of evidence and called an emergency meeting with the chairman and Karen from legal. We met in the boardroom just after midnight. The city outside dark and silent except for the glow of distant traffic lights. I laid out the documents, the purchase records, the connections that tied it all back to Carter's network. The chairman listened in grim silence, his hands folded tightly on the table, his expression as serious as I'd ever seen it. When I finished, he exhaled slowly and asked the only question that mattered. How close are they to gaining control? Karen answered before I could. Close enough that waiting would be a mistake, but not close enough that we're out of options. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us, the realization that this wasn't over, that the threat we thought we had contained was once again at our door. The next 48 hours were a blur of action. We called an emergency board session, issued freeze orders on questionable transactions, and contacted the investor group directly, making it clear that their plan had been exposed and that Nexera wouldn't be an easy target. I spoke to stakeholders, employees, and partners, making sure that no one was left in the dark or swayed by promises that had no foundation. In the end, it worked. The investor group backed away, unwilling to tie themselves to a scheme that had fallen apart before it truly began. Carter's plan crumbled, leaving him without leverage and without the comeback he had been counting on. I never heard from him directly, but I didn't need to. The silence that followed spoke louder than any words could have. With the immediate threat gone, I had a decision to make, one I hadn't fully considered until that moment. I could have stayed, could have continued to lead Nexera with the title I had earned and the power I had always wielded quietly. But as I stood by the window one morning, watching the sun rise over the skyline, I felt something shift inside me. I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my career fighting off men like Carter, forever bracing for the next scheme, the next power grab. I had done what I came to do. I had protected what mattered. And now it was time to step back. I met with the chairman that afternoon, told him of my decision to step away from day-to-day operations, though I would remain a shareholder and advisor as needed. He tried to persuade me to reconsider, but I had made up my mind. Sometimes the strongest move isn't to stay and fight the next battle. Sometimes it's to know when you've done enough and leave the field before it consumes you. On my last official day, I packed my things quietly, no fanfare, no farewell speeches. I walked through the building one final time, stopping to speak with a few colleagues, to thank them for their work, their resilience, their integrity. When I reached the lobby, I paused and looked around at the place I had given so much to, the place I had saved more than once. And then I stepped out into the crisp morning air, the city bustling around me, full of stories just waiting to unfold. As I walked away from Nexera, I felt light, free in a way I hadn't in years. I knew I had done what I set out to do, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. Let others chase titles and power plays. I had learned the greatest lesson of all. Real strength comes not from holding on, but from knowing when to let go.